The salt-stained windows of the Siren's Rest hadn't been properly cleaned in months, giving the entire tavern a perpetually hazy appearance, as though it existed in a permanent state of twilight. Captain James Merrick preferred it that way. Clarity was overrated, especially when you were drowning in regrets that refused to sink quietly to the bottom of the sea where they belonged. He'd been sitting at the bar for the better part of 3 hours, nursing the same glass of whiskey he'd ordered when the afternoon light still streamed through those grimy windows. The burn of the liquor had long since faded, replaced by a dull numbness that felt appropriate given his circumstances. At 52 years old, Merrick was a man defined by a career that was slipping through his fingers like sand through an hourglass. 23 years of naval service, 2 decades and nearly a quarter, and for what? He'd risen to the rank of captain, yes, but that meant nothing anymore. The Navy had moved on without him. Younger men with connections, men who'd never fired a shot in actual combat, were receiving promotions and assignments to prestigious positions. Meanwhile, Merrick was being quietly shuffled into administrative duties, desk work, and finally, early retirement with a pension so meager it barely covered his rent. The bartender, old Dominic, knew better than to engage him in conversation. Merrick had scared off 3 other patrons with his dark silences and the way his jaw tightened whenever someone mentioned the Navy. The tavern suited him perfectly. It was a place where broken men came to nurse their wounds and pretend the world hadn't forgotten them. The walls were dark wood, stained by decades of pipe smoke and the occasional spilled drink. Nautical memorabilia hung haphazardly. A ship's wheel missing 2 spokes, faded photographs of merchant vessels from decades past, and dozens of maps, some official, some hand-drawn by sailors with questionable cartography skills. It was one of these maps that had captured Merrick's attention. A large, detailed chart of the Eastern trade routes hung directly behind the bar, its edges curled and yellowed with age. Merrick had been studying it with the intensity of a man searching for something he'd lost, tracing the familiar paths his ships had sailed, remembering the storms they'd weathered, the narrow escapes from Castellan raiders, the successful convoy missions that no longer seemed to matter in the grand scheme of things. He was so absorbed in these melancholic ruminations that he almost didn't notice her arrival. The tavern door swung open with a sharp creak, letting in a gust of October wind that made the few patrons present glance up irritably. She stood in the doorway for only a moment, but it was enough for Merrick to register the unusual nature of her presence. This wasn't a woman seeking refuge from a broken marriage or drowning sorrows like so many who haunted this place. This woman moved with purpose. Her dark navy coat was well maintained, neither ostentatiously wealthy nor dishearably poor. Her dark hair, streaked with gray, was pinned neatly at the base of her neck, practical and efficient. She was perhaps 45, maybe 50, her face marked by lines that suggested intelligence rather than excess. What struck Merrick most profoundly was her gaze. As she crossed the threshold and let the door settle behind her, her eyes swept across the tavern with an evaluative precision that made him think of a military commander assessing a battlefield. She wasn't looking at the people. She was cataloging the space, noting the exits, measuring distances, evaluating resources. "Brandy," she said to Dominic, her voice steady and clear. "Your best if you have it." Dominic almost smiled, before disappearing to retrieve a bottle from the back. The woman turned and began walking toward the bar, and Merrick found himself watching her with an intensity that embarrassed him slightly. She moved without the hesitancy he'd come to expect from women in establishments like this. She didn't flutter or apologize for her presence. She simply existed with absolute certainty in the space she occupied. To his genuine surprise, she chose to sit on the empty stool directly beside him. "The Eastern trade routes," she said quietly, not looking at him but at the map he'd been studying. "You know them well." It wasn't phrased as a question, but Merrick answered anyway, his curiosity overriding his typical reserve. "Sailed them for more than 2 decades. "Sailed?" she asked, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, missing nothing. or commanded?" "Both," Merrick replied carefully. "Commanded for the last 8 years before I was reassigned to desk work." A subtle smile played at her lips, not mocking, but understanding. "The Navy's loss," she said, turning her attention back to the map. Dominic returned with her brandy, and she accepted it with a polite nod before continuing to study the chart with an intensity that matched Merrick's own. "You study it like someone planning something," Merrick ventured, surprised by his own boldness. "I study it like someone who understands that maps are stories," she replied thoughtfully. "They show us where we've been and hint at where we might go. This particular map tells me something interesting about your Eastern Fleet's vulnerabilities." She pointed to a stretch of water near the Aldermere Straits. "Here, your standard convoy formations leave you exposed if a coordinated attack comes from both sides of the passage. You'd be trapped between the narrows." Merrick's eyes widened. She'd identified in 15 seconds what had bothered him for years, a tactical weakness that his commanding officers had dismissed as theoretical risk. "That's remarkably perceptive," he said slowly. "Or remarkably obvious, depending on your perspective," she replied, sipping her brandy. She still hadn't properly introduced herself. "The question isn't whether the vulnerability exists. The question is whether anyone with authority has the vision to address it." They continued talking for the next hour, though Merrick later couldn't quite recall the exact progression of their conversation. She asked detailed questions about naval formations, supply routes, and crew morale. She listened more than she spoke, but when she offered observations, they were always insightful, sometimes disturbingly so. She seemed to understand naval strategy at a level that suggested more than casual interest. When she finally rose to leave, the tavern had grown darker, lit now primarily by candlelight. She placed coin on the bar, more than enough to cover her drink, and turned to Merrick. "My advice, Captain," she said, "don't let them convince you that 23 years of wisdom means nothing. Men like you built this Navy. Don't accept being discarded." She was gone before he could respond, slipping out into the October night as quietly as she'd arrived. Merrick sat alone with his whiskey, staring at the map, trying to make sense of the strange encounter. He had the distinct feeling that his life had just shifted on its axis, though he couldn't possibly explain why. The woman had been interesting, certainly intelligent, but there was something else, something indefinable that suggested he just met someone far more significant than a chance tavern acquaintance. He would learn the truth far sooner than he expected. The official summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, sealed with the Naval Ministry's crimson wax. Merrick's hands trembled as he broke the seal, though whether from dread or anticipation, he couldn't determine. 3 weeks had passed since his encounter with the mysterious woman in the Siren's Rest, 3 weeks during which he'd attempted to convince himself that their conversation had been nothing more than a pleasant interlude in an otherwise dreary existence. He'd even stopped visiting the tavern, fearing he might appear desperate if she returned and found him lingering. The letter was brief. "Captain James Merrick is ordered to report to the Naval Ministry, East Wing, Conference Room 7, at precisely 10 o'clock on the morning of November 3rd. This attendance is mandatory and concerns matters of immediate importance." Merrick read it 3 times, each reading amplifying his anxiety. Mandatory summons from the ministry typically meant one of 2 things. Either a promotion was being offered, something he'd stopped expecting years ago, or his early retirement was being accelerated due to budget constraints. Neither prospect felt particularly encouraging. He spent the morning in a state of agitated waiting, changing his uniform twice, checking his appearance in the mirror obsessively, and reviewing his service record as though cramming for an examination that would determine his fate. The Naval Ministry building was an imposing structure of white marble and black iron, situated overlooking the harbor. Merrick had been here countless times, but never with his heart pounding quite so forcefully against his ribs. The marble hallway was cold and echoed with the sound of his footsteps as he climbed toward the East Wing. Other officers passed him in the corridors, some nodding in recognition, others deliberately looking away. He wondered if they knew something he didn't, if his dismissal was already common knowledge among the upper ranks. Conference Room 7 was on the third floor, at the end of a long corridor lined with portraits of legendary commanders from naval history. Admiral Thaddeus Crane glared down at him from one frame, his expression stern and unforgiving. Merrick had served under Crane 15 years ago, a brilliant tactician but a brutal taskmaster who deemed Merrick competent but uninspired. He wondered if Crane's disapproval had somehow influenced the decisions being made today. The conference room door was heavy oak, and when Merrick pushed it open, he was struck by the sheer number of officers assembled inside. 7 captains sat around a long mahogany table, along with 3 admirals and the Navy's chief of operations, Admiral Thomas Whitmore. Merrick's stomach clenched. This was a formal assembly, the kind that preceded major announcements. "Captain Merrick," Admiral Whitmore acknowledged, gesturing to an empty chair. "Thank you for joining us on such short notice." Merrick took his seat, acutely aware of being studied by every person in the room. The other captains he recognized, men like Captain Edward Fallow, known for his aggressive tactics and his superior attitude toward officers he deemed beneath him. Captain Henrik Sorensen, a tradition-bound officer who'd spent 30 years repeating the same strategies, and Captain Robert Vance, a younger man who represented the new generation of naval leadership that seemed determined to push out the old guard. But it was the figure standing near the window that stopped his breath entirely. She stood in profile, studying a large naval map mounted on the wall, her dark hair catching the morning sunlight. She wore the Navy dress coat of a captain, and upon her shoulders, Merrick's eyes widened as he processed the insignia, were the emblems of a captain commander, a rank he'd only ever seen on 3 occasions in his entire career. The woman from the Siren's Rest turned slowly to face the assembled officers, and in that moment, Merrick understood with absolute, crystalline clarity that his life was about to change irreversibly. "Gentlemen," Admiral Whitmore announced, his voice carrying the weight of consequence, "I present Captain Elizabeth Hartwell, newly appointed to the rank of Captain Commander and assigned command of the entire Eastern Fleet, effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. Merrick could feel the shock radiating from the other captains like heat from a furnace. Captain Fallow's face darkened with anger. Sorensen's mouth opened as though he'd been struck. Even the admirals appeared uncomfortable, as though they were announcing something they themselves hadn't quite accepted. Elizabeth Hartwell stepped forward, her movements deliberate and controlled. She was smaller than Merrick remembered, perhaps 5'7", but something about her presence seemed to expand to fill the entire room. Her dark eyes swept across each officer in turn, cataloging reactions with what appeared to be clinical precision. "I understand this appointment is unexpected," she began, her voice steady and commanding. There was no apology in her tone, no attempt to soften the blow of her presence. "I suspect several of you are questioning how a woman has been assigned to command the kingdom's most strategically important naval force. I don't require your approval on that matter. The Crown has made its decision, and that decision is final." Captain Fallow stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is preposterous," he declared, his face flushed with rage. "The Eastern Fleet is responsible for protecting our most critical trade routes. We cannot entrust such responsibility to—" "To what, Captain Fallow?" Hartwell interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a blade of ice, her eyes fixed on him with such intensity that he actually stepped backward. "To someone whose qualifications you haven't bothered to examine, to someone whose strategic knowledge might exceed your own, to someone who possesses a different gender than you prefer." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle. "I suggest you choose your next words very carefully, Captain. I'm not here to debate my legitimacy with men who have grown comfortable with mediocrity." The raw power of her dismissal was stunning. Fallow, who was known for his aggressive intimidation of subordinate officers, appeared to shrivel beneath her gaze. He sank back into his chair without another word. Hartwell continued as though the interruption had never occurred. You will each receive detailed briefing packets regarding my strategic vision for the fleet. You will review them thoroughly. We will begin implementation at dawn tomorrow. Any officer unwilling to embrace the necessary changes may submit their resignation immediately. No questions asked, no judgment rendered. But make no mistake, those who remain will execute my orders with full commitment. She turned back to the map, as though the meeting was already concluded. Admiral Whitmore cleared his throat awkwardly. Captain Hartwell will be based aboard the Vigilant. Each of you will report to her with your fleet readiness assessments within 48 hours. Dismissed. The officers filed out in an unusual silence. Merrick found himself lingering, unable to move, unable to process what he'd witnessed. Hartwell was still studying the map, but when she sensed his presence, she turned. "Captain Merrick," she said, as though they were continuing a conversation from merely hours ago instead of weeks. "I trust you've recovered from your pessimism at the tavern." You were." Merrick struggled to form coherent words. "A strategist assessing talent," she finished for him. "Yes, you asked if I studied maps like someone planning something. I was planning this. I was also evaluating the officers who would need to work beneath me." She moved closer, her expression intense. "The question is whether you're willing to be part of something revolutionary or whether you've resigned yourself to irrelevance." Merrick straightened, his uncertainty crystallizing into determination. "I'm ready," he said. Hartwell smiled, genuinely smiled for the first time. "Good," she replied. "Then let's begin." Mutiny wasn't violent or overt. It was far more subtle than that. A quiet resistance that manifested in delayed responses to orders, questions posed in deliberately challenging ways, and private conversations among the captains that Hartwell was clearly meant to overhear. Within the first week of her command, it became abundantly clear that the officers of the Eastern Fleet had decided to test their new commander's authority through a campaign of strategic insubordination. Captain Fallow was the most aggressive in his resistance. During a tactical briefing, he openly challenged Hartwell's proposed repositioning of supply vessels. "With all due respect, Captain Commander," he said, his tone suggesting anything but respect, "we've been operating these supply routes for 15 years without significant issue. Your suggestion would require massive coordination and leaves us vulnerable during the transition period." Hartwell had simply nodded, made a note in her portfolio, and moved on to the next topic. She didn't argue. She didn't defend her position. She didn't demand immediate compliance. Her lack of reaction seemed to infuriate Fallow even more, as though he'd expected confrontation and had been denied the satisfaction of it. Similar scenarios played out with the other captains. Henrik Sorensen questioned whether her navigation methods were too experimental. Robert Vance suggested that her communication protocols were inefficient. Captain Marcus Ashford, commanding the Defiant, actually filed a formal complaint with the ministry, claiming that Hartwell's orders contradicted established naval protocol. The ministry's response was swift and dismissive. A single paragraph stating that Captain Commander Hartwell possessed full authority to establish new protocols as she deemed necessary. What troubled Merrick more than the overt challenges was what happened during the hours when Hartwell should have been executing her command decisions. Instead of remaining in her quarters or in the command centers, she began visiting each ship personally. She would arrive without announcement, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes during the middle of the day. And then she would simply observe. Merrick watched this pattern repeat across the fleet, sometimes from his position aboard the Sovereign, sometimes while accompanying Hartwell on her inspections. She would walk the decks of each vessel with unhurried deliberation. She would examine the rigging, checking knots, and tensioning with hands that clearly knew what they were doing. She would review navigation charts, not dismissively, but with genuine interest, asking questions that revealed she understood the mathematics underlying celestial positioning. What truly astounded Merrick was her attention to the enlisted men and women who comprised the backbone of the fleet. She would ask sailors their names, their origins, how long they'd served. She remembered these details. Weeks later, she'd reference a conversation with a quartermaster's mate named Thomas, asking about his daughter's recovery from illness. The man had been visibly moved that someone of her rank even remembered he had a daughter. One evening, Merrick found her on his deck at nearly midnight, reviewing his ship's battle records by lantern light. The Sovereign had fought through 3 significant naval engagements, and Hartwell was studying each one with meticulous attention. "Your formations are predictable," she said without preamble, pointing to a series of sketches documenting the battle strategies employed during a skirmish with Castellan raiders 2 years prior. "Here, here, and here. Your enemy anticipated you every time. They were waiting for your response because they'd observed your patterns." Merrick felt his pride ignite defensively. He'd survived 2 decades of naval warfare. His formations had served him well. Before he could respond with anger, however, Hartwell continued. "But your instincts are sound," she said, her tone shifting to something almost encouraging. "You've survived this long for a reason. You read your crew effectively, and you adapt when circumstances demand it. What you lack isn't capability, Captain. You lack perspective. You've been operating within a system that rewards consistency over innovation, and that system has served you well, until it doesn't." She set down the documents and turned to face him fully. "I'm not here to demean what you've accomplished. I'm here to ask you to trust me long enough to understand what I'm trying to build. Your men respect you because you care about their welfare. I've observed that. The question is whether you're willing to extend that same trust to someone trying to care for the entire fleet." It was perhaps the most disarming thing she could have said. Merrick had been prepared for demands and directives. He'd been prepared to resist or comply based on military protocol. He hadn't been prepared for genuine respect disguised within a request for partnership. As the weeks progressed, Hartwell's approach became increasingly clear. She was systematically dismantling the captain's resistance not through force, but through presence and understanding. She spent time with the engineers, learning how each ship's engine functioned. She reviewed every sailor's service record in the entire fleet, all 300 of them. She sat in the galley during meal times, listening to conversations without participating. She seemed to exist in a state of constant learning, absorbing the knowledge and culture of the fleet, with the intensity of someone preparing for an examination. The resistance didn't crumble so much as it gradually transformed. Captain Sorensen, after watching Hartwell identify a critical maintenance issue on his ship that his own engineers had missed, began asking her opinion on technical matters. Captain Ashford, realizing that his formal complaint had been completely disregarded, seemed to accept his irrelevance and begrudgingly began following orders more promptly. Captain Fallow remained the most defiant, but even he grew quieter, less outwardly hostile. Merrick suspected Fallow was simply waiting for an opportunity to prove Hartwell's theories wrong, hoping that her untested strategies would fail catastrophically and vindicate his original skepticism. What Merrick experienced personally was a gradual shift from skepticism to fascination. He found himself volunteering to spend time in her presence, offering to escort her on ship inspections, requesting meetings to discuss strategic concerns. Hartwell never refused these interactions, but she also never initiated them. She seemed content to allow the captains to come to their own conclusions about her competence. One night after reviewing the Sovereign's readiness reports, Merrick asked her a question that had been bothering him for weeks. "Why didn't you fight back? When Fallow challenged you in that first meeting, when Sorensen questioned your methods, when Ashford filed his complaint, why didn't you assert your authority more forcefully?" Hartwell considered the question carefully before responding. "Because asserting authority through force is what weak commanders do," she said quietly. "They demand compliance because they can't inspire it. I needed you to respect my competence, not fear my rank. Fear creates a hollow army. Respect creates warriors who would follow you into hell because they trust your judgment." She paused, her dark eyes studying him with that penetrating gaze he'd come to recognize. "And it worked, didn't it, Captain Merrick? You came to your own conclusion about my capabilities. That's infinitely more valuable than compliance born from intimidation." Merrick realized in that moment that he wasn't just beginning to understand why she'd been appointed to command the fleet. He was beginning to understand that she was far more intelligent, far more strategic, and far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. And somehow, that realization felt oddly comforting. The scout ship Patron signaled its distress code at dawn on a gray November morning, the flags whipping frantically in the cold wind that swept across the harbor. Merrick was in his quarters reviewing navigation reports when the alarm bells began tolling, not the routine calls that marked shift changes, but the urgent, rapid clanging that indicated an emergency requiring immediate assembly. He rushed to the deck where his crew was already scrambling to stations, their movements sharp and efficient from months of Hartwell's intensive training protocols. The signal was unmistakable. A merchant convoy they'd been assigned to protect had encountered hostile naval forces in the Aldermere Straits. The Petrel, serving as a forward scout, had detected 3 Castellan warships, the Corsair, the Ravager, and the Bloodthirst, bearing down on the convoy with clear hostile intent. Merrick's blood ran cold. The Castellan vessels were formidable opponents, each one comparable in firepower to his own ship. 3 of them, working in coordination, represented a threat that could devastate an unprepared fleet. The merchant convoy consisted of 6 vessels, lightly armed and designed for trade rather than combat. Without naval support, they would be slaughtered within hours. Within minutes, Hartwell's orders began arriving via signal flags and messenger boats, spreading across the fleet with military precision. The signal that came first was startling in its apparent contradiction. "All vessels hold position. Do not advance toward Aldermere. Await further orders." The other captains' reactions were immediate and negative. Captain Fallow signaled his protest. "Convoy in immediate danger. Recommend immediate engagement." Captain Sorensen's message was similar. "Delay risks merchant lives. Suggest immediate mobilization." But Hartwell's response was absolute. "Hold position. That is in order." Merrick found himself torn between military protocol and his instinctive agreement with the other captains. Leaving a convoy to suffer while the fleet stood idle seemed cowardly, almost criminal. Yet something in his understanding of Hartwell's previous behavior suggested that her silence wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. She appeared on the deck of the Sovereign an hour later, moving with the calm precision that had become characteristic of her command style. Merrick offered her the navigation station, and she accepted with a slight nod. "The Castellans expect us to respond predictably," she said, studying the charts that detailed the convoy's position relative to the straits. "They've waited for us to send our forces rushing to protect the merchant vessels. They're positioned their 3 ships in a classic triangle formation, anticipating that we'll attempt to break through. When we do, they'll close the triangle and trap us between the narrow waters and their firepower." She moved her finger across the map, tracing invisible paths. "But what if we didn't do what they expect?" At her command, the fleet began to move, not toward Aldermere, but in a seemingly random pattern that confused the other captains. Ships spread outward, creating distance between themselves. The Sovereign headed northeast, away from the crisis entirely. The Defiant moved southwest. The Vigilant, Hartwell's flagship, began a slow northwestern trajectory. To any observer, it would appear that Hartwell's fleet was abandoning the merchant convoy entirely. Merrick wanted to protest but remained silent, trusting the process he'd been gradually coming to understand. Hartwell's eyes never left the charts as she called out positioning orders, her voice steady and authoritative. She seemed to be orchestrating something far more complex than a simple battle response. By midday, the Petrel sent another signal. The Castellan ships had realized they couldn't defeat the merchant convoy and were beginning to advance, searching for the naval fleet. They appeared confident, even somewhat leisurely in their pursuit. To them, they'd driven away 3 ships with minimal effort, and now they were hunting prey that seemed to be running. "Now," Hartwell said softly. What followed was a transformation of chaos into precision. The seemingly scattered fleet suddenly shifted its movements with surgical accuracy. The Sovereign, along with 2 other vessels, began converging from the northeast. The Defiant and its companion ship moved from the southwest. The Vigilant and 3 additional vessels started their approach from the northwest and north. It was a coordinated pincer movement, so perfectly timed that the Castellans didn't realize they were being encircled until it was far too late. The Castellan commander attempted to escape, recognizing the trap as it closed around him. But Hartwell had anticipated this too. She'd positioned the fastest ships to cut off retreat routes. The Castellan vessels found themselves surrounded, with no path to open water, their ability to maneuver severely limited by the tactical positioning of Hartwell's fleet. The battle itself was almost anticlimactic. The Castellan ships attempted to fight, but they were hopelessly outmaneuvered. Hartwell coordinated the fleet's movements using an innovative system of colored signal flags and coordinated cannon fire that prevented the enemy from concentrating their defense on any single target. Before they could inflict significant damage on Hartwell's vessels, all 3 Castellan ships were forced to surrender. When the cannon smoke cleared and silence fell over the water, Merrick realized that not a single member of his crew had been killed. The merchant convoy was not only protected, but entirely unscathed. The Castellan vessels had been defeated without sustaining casualties on either side, something he'd never witnessed in naval warfare. The other captains' responses were immediate and dramatic. Captain Sorensen's signal was simple: "Captain Commander, you are a tactical genius." Captain Fallow's signal took longer to arrive, but when it did, it read, "Request permission to observe your strategic planning sessions. I have much to learn." Even Captain Ashford, who'd filed the formal complaint, sent a message: "My sincere apologies for doubting your competence. You've earned my complete respect." Merrick stood on his deck watching as the Castellan ships were escorted into harbor under heavy guard, and he experienced something profound, a complete dissolution of whatever skepticism had remained. He'd witnessed not luck, not aggression, not traditional naval tactics. He'd witnessed a level of strategic thinking that transcended everything he'd been taught about warfare. That evening, Hartwell requested his presence in her quarters aboard the Vigilant. When he arrived, she was reviewing charts by candlelight, already planning the next phase of operations. "You questioned my earlier hesitation," she said without preamble. "You wanted to charge into battle immediately." "I did," Merrick admitted. "But you didn't," Hartwell continued. "You trusted my judgment despite every instinct telling you I was wrong. That's the quality I was searching for in my captains." She set down her charts and looked at him directly. "Today, you became a true partner in this command structure, not merely a subordinate following orders. The question now is whether you're ready to help me transform this entire fleet." Merrick straightened, his voice steady and certain. "I am Captain Commander, absolutely." Hartwell smiled, that rare, genuine smile. "Then we have much work to do." 3 weeks after the Aldermere victory, Merrick requested a private audience with Hartwell. He sent the formal request through proper channels, half expecting it to be denied or indefinitely delayed. To his surprise, it was approved within hours, with instructions to meet her aboard the Vigilant at 8 o'clock in the evening. The flagship's corridors were quieter at night, lit by strategically placed lanterns that cast dancing shadows on the polished walls. Merrick's footsteps echoed as he made his way toward her quarters, his mind churning with what he wanted to communicate. He'd spent days considering this conversation, rehearsing phrases that never quite captured the magnitude of what he felt needed to be said. When he arrived at her quarters, Hartwell was exactly as he'd found her that first night aboard his ship, surrounded by maps and charts, illuminated by candlelight, absorbed in the work of strategic planning. She looked up from the documents spread across her oak desk, and her expression shifted into something almost welcoming. "Captain Merrick," she said, gesturing to a chair positioned across from her workspace. "I've been expecting you, though perhaps not quite this formally. Your request suggested grave matters requiring discussion." Merrick settled into the chair, suddenly aware of how carefully his hands were gripping the armrests. "Captain Commander," he began, his voice rougher than he intended, "I owe you an apology." Hartwell set down her quill and gave him her full attention. "For what specifically, Captain? Your resistance during the first weeks of my command, your skepticism regarding my strategic decisions, your initial assumption that I was unsuitable for this position." A slight smile played at her lips. "You'll need to be more specific." "All of it," Merrick replied, meeting her gaze. "I doubted you, not just once but repeatedly. I questioned your decisions. I listened to the other captains' complaints and found them credible. I allowed my own biases to cloud my judgment regarding your qualifications. You earned my respect through demonstration, not through the authority of your rank, and that should have been unnecessary. I should have recognized your competence from the moment we met." Hartwell rose from her desk and moved to a cabinet positioned against the wall. She retrieved a bottle of quality brandy and 2 glasses, pouring with deliberate care before returning to her seat. "You're not the first to doubt me," she said quietly, sliding 1 glass toward him. "And I suspect you won't be the last, though the nature of that doubt may change." She sipped her brandy thoughtfully. "The apology is appreciated, but it's not entirely necessary. You reacted precisely as I anticipated. In fact, I would have been concerned if you hadn't questioned my appointment." "How can you say that?" Merrick asked, accepting the brandy but not yet drinking. "Your own officers challenged you openly. Captain Fallow was openly hostile. The entire command structure was in rebellion." "Because," Hartwell said, leaning back in her chair, "I needed to understand who these men truly were. Blind obedience doesn't interest me. I wanted to see which of you possessed the capacity for growth, which of you were intelligent enough to recognize when your initial assumptions were wrong, and which of you would be irredeemably stuck in tradition." She paused, studying him with that penetrating gaze that seemed to catalog information at a molecular level. "You, Captain Merrick, demonstrated something rare. You were skeptical but not hostile. You questioned but remained open to evidence. When confronted with proof of my competence, you adjusted your assessment. That's a quality that separates exceptional officers from mediocre ones." Merrick finally drank his brandy, the warmth spreading through his chest. "You mentioned knowing about the resistance from the beginning. How is that possible? Your appointment seemed to come as a genuine surprise to everyone." "It did," Hartwell confirmed. "But I had several months of preparation before that announcement. I spent time at the Siren's Rest, at other establishments where naval officers congregated, observing your culture, understanding the dynamics within your command structure. I reviewed every captain's service record, every commendation, every complaint filed against them. I studied the fleet's performance over the past decade, identifying weaknesses in strategy and leadership." She stood and walked to a map of the Eastern Fleet's operational area hanging on her wall. "I knew that announcing my appointment would generate resistance. That resistance was necessary. It allowed me to identify which officers were capable of adapting, and which were hopelessly committed to maintaining the status quo. The ones who adapted, like you, became my true officers. The ones who couldn't, like Fallow, eventually either recognized the futility of their resistance or removed themselves from meaningful command." "But how did you gain the authority to implement this appointment?" Merrick pressed. "Something like this requires approval from the Crown, from the Ministry. Surely they wouldn't support such an unprecedented decision without extraordinary justification." Hartwell turned from the map, and her expression grew distant, tinged with something that might have been pain. "That's a longer story, Captain, one that requires some context about who I am beyond the rank I wear." She settled back into her chair and began to speak, her words carefully measured. 7 years ago, I wasn't a captain commander. I was a strategist, working in the shadows of the naval ministry, developing tactical approaches and reviewing strategic vulnerabilities. My work was primarily theoretical. I studied naval history, identified patterns in successful and failed campaigns, and submitted recommendations to admirals who would either accept or reject them based on their own judgment. She paused to drink more brandy. The kingdom faced a critical situation approximately 5 years ago, a potential alliance between the Castellan fleet and the Nordian naval forces. Such an alliance would have been catastrophic, potentially crippling our maritime trade entirely. The Admiralty was divided on how to respond. Some advocated for aggressive military posturing. Others suggested diplomatic approaches. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. "What did you do?" Merrick asked, fully engaged now. "I proposed a strategy that seemed radical at the time," Hartwell continued. "I recommended a series of calculated naval maneuvers designed to simultaneously demonstrate military strength while subtly encouraging division between the Castellan and Nordian leadership. The strategy was complex, requiring months of precise execution and coordination between multiple vessels. But it worked. The proposed alliance collapsed. The Castellan fleet withdrew from our waters, and the Nordian forces returned to their own territories." She leaned forward, her intensity increasing. The Crown recognized that the strategy had come from my analysis. The minister personally requested that I be brought into more visible decision-making roles. But there was a problem. The Navy's traditional command structure doesn't accommodate women in positions of significant authority. The admirals made it clear that my contributions would be valued, but only if I remained invisible, working through male commanders who would receive credit for my strategies. Merrick felt a surge of anger on her behalf. "I refused," Hartwell said simply. "I told the Crown that if my contributions were valuable enough to influence naval policy, then they were valuable enough to carry my name. There was significant resistance. You can imagine the political complications of such a demand. But the minister recognized the strategic value of my work. After considerable negotiation, the Crown agreed to appoint me to command the Eastern Fleet. It was a calculated compromise. Give me authority over one fleet as a test case, demonstrate whether I could lead effectively, and potentially expand my authority if successful. "And if you fail?" Merrick asked quietly. "Then I become a cautionary tale, proof that women are unsuitable for command, and the Navy returns to its traditional hierarchy," Hartwell replied without emotional inflection. "That's precisely why I cannot fail, Captain. My success isn't merely about my personal advancement. It's about establishing a precedent that merit transcends gender, that capability is what matters, not the chromosomes of the person wielding it." She fixed her gaze on him directly. "This is why I needed allies like you, why I needed to transform skeptics into believers. I'm not here to be liked. I'm not here to be accepted gracefully. I'm here to prove that the Navy's future depends on valuing the best strategic minds, regardless of their gender. And I need officers like you, men capable of recognizing excellence and setting aside their preconceptions, to help me accomplish that." Merrick stood, extending his hand across the desk. "Then I'm entirely at your service, Captain Commander, not out of obligation, but out of genuine conviction that you're exactly what this fleet needs." Hartwell stood and clasped his hand firmly. "Then we have much work to accomplish together, Captain Merrick. The real transformation of this fleet begins now." Transformation of the Eastern Fleet didn't happen gradually or subtly. It was a deliberate, aggressive overhaul of every system, every protocol, and every assumption that had guided naval operations for the past century. Hartwell and Merrick worked in concert, with Merrick serving as her second-in-command and the primary liaison between her radical vision and the captains who had to implement it. The first major change was the establishment of a comprehensive training program, unlike anything the Navy had previously attempted. Rather than relying on apprenticeship-style learning, where younger sailors absorbed knowledge from older veterans, Hartwell created a structured curriculum that addressed every aspect of naval operation, from celestial navigation to cannon maintenance to strategic tactical awareness. She recruited the most knowledgeable specialists from across the fleet and had them document their expertise in detailed manuals. The training program was implemented across all 8 ships simultaneously, which initially created chaos. Sailors accustomed to their traditional routines suddenly found themselves attending formal instruction sessions in the evenings. Some resisted, seeing it as unnecessary disruption, but Hartwell had anticipated this resistance and addressed it directly. "Knowledge is power," she announced during a fleet-wide assembly, addressing all 300 sailors gathered on the docks. "Every one of you who understands the mathematics underlying navigation, who can read celestial charts, who understands the mechanical principles that govern your ship's engine, that sailor becomes invaluable. That sailor becomes promotable. That sailor increases their earning potential and their opportunities for advancement." She paused, letting those words settle. "For the first time in this fleet's history, your advancement will depend entirely on your competence and your knowledge, not on your family connections or how long you've served. We are implementing a merit-based promotion system. The smartest sailors will become officers. The most capable officers will command ships. That's a promise I'm making to every one of you." The resistance evaporated almost immediately. Suddenly, sailors who'd never considered formal education were attending classes, studying navigation, learning the theoretical principles that underlay their practical work. Within months, the entire character of the fleet shifted. Conversations on the decks became more sophisticated. Younger sailors began asking detailed questions of their experienced counterparts, not merely accepting "that's how it's always been done" as an answer. The second revolutionary change was the implementation of a new communication system that Hartwell had spent months developing. Instead of relying solely on traditional signal flags, which could be difficult to see in poor weather or at distance, she created a comprehensive system combining colored flags, lantern signals, and a series of rhythmic cannon blasts that conveyed specific tactical information. Captain Sorensen was initially skeptical of the cannon blast component. "That's nothing more than noise," he complained during a strategy session. "How can sound communicate complex tactical information?" Hartwell responded by demonstrating the system personally. She spent an entire day aboard the Defiant, teaching the crew the rhythm patterns that corresponded to specific commands. Short blasts meant one thing, longer blasts meant another. The pattern of intervals between blasts created a language of sorts, allowing ships to communicate across distances where visual signals were impossible. Within 2 weeks, the system was implemented across the fleet. Within a month, Hartwell demonstrated its practical value by coordinating a complex multi-ship maneuver in darkness so complete that visual signals would have been useless. The 8 vessels moved in perfect synchronization, a level of coordination that seemed almost supernatural to observers unfamiliar with her communication system. The most controversial change, however, was the promotion system. Hartwell abolished the traditional hierarchy that promoted officers based primarily on tenure and family connections. A young sailor named Thomas Whitmore, no relation to Admiral Whitmore, had demonstrated exceptional tactical insight during training exercises. Despite being barely 22 years old and only 3 years into his naval service, Hartwell recommended him for promotion to junior officer. Captain Fallow was livid. "This is absurd," he declared, slamming his hand on the table during a command meeting. "The boy has barely completed a single full rotation. Promoting him ahead of men with 20 years of experience is insulting to everyone who's served with integrity." "I'm not promoting him ahead of anyone," Hartwell replied calmly. "I'm evaluating him based on demonstrated competence. If those men with 20 years of experience are more competent, they should be promoted as well. But competence isn't measured by tenure, Captain. It's measured by capability. She turned to address the entire assembly of captains. I'm implementing a formal evaluation system. Every officer and sailor in this fleet will be assessed based on specific criteria: technical knowledge, tactical acuity, leadership capability, and decision-making quality under pressure. These evaluations will occur quarterly. Promotions will be awarded based on demonstrated excellence against these criteria, not based on how long someone has served or who their parents were. The system was controversial, but results were undeniable. Within 6 months, the most competent sailors, regardless of age or background, began rising through the ranks. Some experienced officers who'd coasted along on tradition without developing genuine expertise found themselves passed over for promotion. A few, including Captain Fallow, submitted their resignations in protest. Others, like Captain Sorensen, adapted and found themselves respected by younger officers who were now advancing based on merit rather than lineage. The fleet's operational effectiveness increased exponentially. Under Hartwell's command, response times to emerging threats decreased by 40%. The accuracy of cannon fire improved by 30%. Supply route efficiency increased by 25%. These improvements weren't the result of better vessels or superior firepower. They were the result of a better trained, more motivated, more intelligently managed crew. Merrick's role in this transformation was crucial. As Hartwell's second-in-command, he served as her translator, helping the older, more traditional captains understand her vision while protecting the vision from being compromised by traditionalists too invested in preserving the old ways. He worked 18-hour days, moving between ships, observing training sessions, evaluating officers' progress, and reporting directly to Hartwell. By the end of the first year, the Eastern Fleet had become something unprecedented, a naval force that combined traditional maritime expertise with revolutionary training methods and meritocratic advancement. Word of the fleet's transformation spread across maritime nations. Other kingdoms sent envoys to observe their methods. Naval academies began requesting Hartwell's training manuals. The Navy that had initially viewed her appointment as a political embarrassment now recognized her as a transformative leader. During the second year, Hartwell expanded her initiatives beyond training and promotion systems. She implemented innovations in ship maintenance that extended vessel lifespans significantly. She developed new tactical formations that maximized defensive capability while maintaining offensive flexibility. She created a system of mentorship pairing experienced officers with promising younger sailors, facilitating knowledge transfer in a structured, intentional way. By the end of the second year, the Eastern Fleet was the most advanced, most effectively coordinated naval force in the world. And Merrick, standing at Hartwell's side, had transformed from a doubtful captain facing early retirement into a naval officer recognized throughout the kingdom as one of the most capable commanders in active service. One evening, as they reviewed operational reports together in her quarters, Hartwell looked at him and smiled, that rare, genuine expression of satisfaction. "We did this," she said simply. "Not we. Your willingness to embrace change, to challenge your own assumptions, to work alongside someone you initially doubted, that's what made this revolution possible." Merrick returned her smile. "You provided the vision," he replied, "but you were right, you needed allies, and I'm honored to be yours." Summons arrived on a crisp March morning, this time delivered not by official courier but by a personal envoy from the Crown. Admiral Thomas Whitmore himself appeared aboard the Vigilant, his expression carefully neutral as he handed Hartwell a sealed letter bearing the royal insignia. Merrick watched from a discreet distance as Hartwell broke the seal and read the contents, her expression revealing nothing, a skill she'd perfected over her years in service. "The Crown requests my presence in the capital," she announced to Merrick once the Admiral had departed. "Within the week, formal attire required. The minister intends to make an announcement regarding my future position." Merrick felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. They both understood what this likely meant. The successful transformation of the Eastern Fleet had attracted the Crown's attention, and the initial appointment was being viewed not as an experiment but as a triumph. Yet uncertainty remained. In the political world that governed the Navy, triumph could as easily lead to reassignment, expanded authority, or complications they couldn't anticipate. "What do you think it means?" Merrick ventured carefully. "I think," Hartwell replied, studying the letter with the intensity she brought to all strategic documents, "that the Crown has decided whether my appointment was a success or a failure. The fact that the minister himself is making an announcement suggests it's not a reassignment. Beyond that, I prefer not to speculate." But Merrick could see the tension in her shoulders, the slight tightness around her eyes. Even Hartwell, with all her calculated composure, was feeling the weight of this moment. The capital city of Ashford was a sprawling metropolis of white stone and golden domes, situated along the kingdom's largest river. The Crown's palace dominated the skyline, an architectural marvel of soaring towers and intricate stonework that had been constructed over 3 centuries. Hartwell arrived on a Tuesday morning, dressed in full naval dress uniform, her insignia polished to mirror brightness. Merrick accompanied her, along with a small contingent of officers representing the Eastern Fleet. The ceremony was scheduled for the Grand Hall, a space so enormous that footsteps echoed across marble floors that reflected the elaborate ceiling paintings depicting centuries of naval history. Hundreds of officers, nobles, and dignitaries had assembled, the highest echelons of military and political power in the kingdom. Merrick stood among them, wearing his formal uniform, feeling the weight of the moment like a physical presence. The First Minister, Lord Adrian Coldwell, entered with the ceremonial procession. He was an elderly man, his face marked by decades of political maneuvering, his bearing suggesting the absolute confidence of someone accustomed to wielding significant power. Behind him came the Crown's official attendants carrying the symbols of various military ranks and positions. "Captain Commander Elizabeth Hartwell," Lord Coldwell's voice resonated through the cavernous hall, "please step forward." Hartwell moved with her characteristic precision, her movements controlled and deliberate. She positioned herself before the assembled dignitaries, her expression calm despite the magnitude of the moment. "It is the pleasure of the Crown," Lord Coldwell announced, his words carrying through the silent hall, "to recognize your extraordinary service to the kingdom and your revolutionary transformation of the Eastern Fleet. In the 3 years since your appointment, the Eastern Fleet has become the most advanced, most effectively coordinated naval force in the world. Your innovations in training, your implementation of merit-based advancement, your tactical innovations, these have established new standards for naval excellence." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "The Crown, in recognition of your demonstrated excellence and in acknowledgement of your proven capability to lead at the highest levels, is pleased to appoint you to the position of Supreme Commander of all naval forces. You will hold authority over every ship, every sailor, every naval operation conducted in service to this kingdom. This position places you among the highest-ranking military officers in our realm." A formal attendant stepped forward bearing the insignia of this new rank, a compass rose fashioned from gold, its points facing in all directions, symbolizing complete authority over all waters and all strategic directions. The crowning symbol of naval command, something that had never before been granted to a woman. Merrick watched as the attendant carefully removed Hartwell's Captain Commander insignia and replaced it with the compass rose. The gesture was simultaneously simple and monumental, a physical representation of her ascension to unprecedented authority. The applause that followed was thunderous, filling the grand hall with sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the palace. Merrick found himself clapping with genuine enthusiasm, though he noticed some officers in the crowd whose applause seemed more perfunctory. their expressions suggesting reluctant acknowledgement rather than genuine celebration. But what captured Merrick's attention most profoundly was the moment when Hartwell's eyes swept across the assembled crowd and found his. In that instant, he saw something rare, a genuine expression of emotion crossing her normally composed features. It wasn't triumph or satisfaction, though both were surely present. It was something deeper, a recognition that this moment validated not just her own capabilities, but the possibility that the future might be different from the past, that change was genuinely possible. The formal reception that followed was a blur of congratulations and political maneuvering. Nobles and officers approached Hartwell with varying degrees of sincerity. Some clearly saw her appointment as a threat to the traditional order. Others appeared genuinely impressed by her accomplishments. A few, Merrick noticed, seemed calculating, already assessing how they might position themselves advantageously relative to this new power structure. Later that evening, during a more private reception for senior military officers, Merrick found himself in conversation with Admiral Whitmore, the chief of operations who'd announced Hartwell's original appointment to command the Eastern Fleet. "Your captain commander has exceeded every expectation," Whitmore said, accepting a glass of wine from a passing server. "When the Crown first proposed her appointment, I was skeptical. I believed in her capabilities based on her work as a strategist, but I questioned whether the officers under her command would accept her authority. You helped make this possible, Captain Merrick. Your acceptance of her leadership gave the other captains permission to do the same." "She earned their respect through demonstrated competence," Merrick replied. "I simply recognized it before they did." "Regardless," Whitmore continued, "the Crown is discussing expanding her vision to other naval districts. What you've accomplished in the Eastern Fleet is now being studied as a model for restructuring the entire Navy. Hartwell's innovations in training and advancement systems will eventually apply to every vessel under the Kingdom's flag." The implications were staggering. The quiet revolution that had begun with Hartwell's appointment to command the Eastern Fleet was now spreading outward, transforming the entire naval structure of the kingdom. That night, as Merrick returned to the inn where he was staying, he found a note waiting for him. It was in Hartwell's handwriting. "Thank you for standing beside me. Tomorrow, the real work begins. Meet me at the palace at dawn." Merrick understood. The ceremony and the recognition were important, certainly. They validated her appointment and demonstrated the Crown's confidence in her leadership. But to Hartwell, they were merely the beginning. The true challenge would be implementing her vision across the entire Navy, overcoming resistance from traditionalists, and fundamentally reshaping centuries of naval culture. As he prepared for bed, Merrick reflected on his journey from the doubtful captain nursing whiskey in the Siren's Rest to an admiral standing at the side of the kingdom's supreme naval commander. He had witnessed something extraordinary, the rise of someone too capable to be contained by tradition, too intelligent to be dismissed, too visionary to be ignored. And tomorrow, the real transformation would begin. 23 years had passed since Elizabeth Hartwell's appointment as Supreme Commander of all naval forces. The woman who had walked into the Siren's Rest wearing a simple navy coat, studying maritime maps with calculated intensity, was now preparing to step away from active service. Her retirement would mark the end of an era, not just for her personally, but for an entire institution she had fundamentally transformed. The Naval Academy had been restructured entirely under her leadership. The old apprenticeship system was gone, replaced by a comprehensive 4-year training program that produced officers versed not only in traditional maritime skills, but in advanced navigation, strategic theory, and leadership philosophy. The merit-based promotion system she'd pioneered in the Eastern Fleet had been implemented across every naval district. Women served as captains, admirals, and strategic planners throughout the fleet. What had seemed radical and impossible 3 decades ago had become standard practice. The transformation extended far beyond the Navy. The kingdom's military academies, the civil service, and even private merchant companies had begun adopting Hartwell's principles of meritocratic advancement and systematic training. Other kingdoms, observing the Navy's transformation and its resulting superiority, had sent delegations to study her methods. The ripple effects of her leadership had spread across an entire continent. But numbers and statistics, Merrick understood, couldn't capture the true magnitude of her legacy. The real measure of Hartwell's impact existed in the stories: the young woman from a merchant family who became an admiral, the orphan boy who rose from deckhand to captain, the countless individuals who had been given opportunities they would never have received under the old system. Hartwell had changed not just the structure of the Navy. She had changed the cultural assumptions about who was capable of leadership, who deserved advancement, and what merit truly meant. The retirement ceremony took place in the Grand Hall of the Naval Academy, an institution that, under Hartwell's direction, had become the most prestigious military academy in the world. The ceremony was set for late afternoon, with the golden light of setting sun streaming through the enormous windows that overlooked the harbor where countless ships reflected the radiance of the dying day. Merrick, now the highest-ranking admiral in the Navy after Hartwell's anticipated retirement, stood in the Academy's administrative offices preparing for what would be one of the most significant moments of his professional life. In his hands, he held a rolled canvas containing a portrait commissioned specifically for this occasion. The painting had been created by the kingdom's most acclaimed artist, a woman named Sophia Marchetti, who had herself benefited from Hartwell's revolutionary appointment system. Sophia had studied Hartwell for months, conducting numerous sittings to capture not just her physical appearance, but the essence of her character. The result was extraordinary. The Grand Hall filled gradually as officers, sailors, government officials, and Naval Academy students arrived. Merrick estimated that nearly 1,000 people had assembled, a testament to the respect and recognition Hartwell had garnered throughout her career. He noticed that approximately 40% of the officers present were women, a ratio that would have been unthinkable 3 decades ago. Hartwell entered wearing her full dress uniform for the final time as Supreme Commander. She was 72 years old now, her dark hair completely silver, her face marked by lines that told the story of decades spent in serious contemplation and strategic planning. Yet she carried herself with the same composed authority that had characterized her from the beginning: movements precise, expression controlled, presence commanding. Lord Adrian Coldwell, now even more ancient than he'd been at her original appointment, presented the formal acknowledgement of her service. He spoke of her revolutionary leadership, her unprecedented achievements, and the lasting transformation she had brought to the Navy. The speech was respectful, even reverential, but Merrick sensed that Hartwell found such formal tributes somewhat tedious. She'd never sought personal recognition. She'd only cared about the results her leadership produced. Then Merrick stepped forward to present the portrait. "Captain Hartwell," he began, his voice carrying through the hall, "during the past 3 decades, I have had the privilege of serving alongside you, of witnessing your transformation of this institution, and of participating in the revolution you initiated. Today, on behalf of the Navy and the Kingdom, I present this portrait, a permanent reminder of your extraordinary legacy." He carefully unrolled the canvas, revealing Sophia Marchetti's masterpiece to the assembled crowd. The portrait depicted Hartwell standing at the helm of her flagship, the Vigilant, her hand resting confidently on the ship's wheel. Behind her, in meticulously detailed rows, were the 8 vessels of the Eastern Fleet, their sails unfurled, their flags flying proudly. The composition suggested both authority and responsibility. She stood at the center of an immense force that depended upon her judgment and vision. But what made the portrait truly powerful was the expression Sophia had captured in Hartwell's face. It wasn't the stern, impassive mask she wore in most official photographs. Instead, Sophia had rendered a woman whose eyes reflected the weight of her responsibility, whose slight smile conveyed quiet confidence, and whose entire bearing suggested someone who understood the profound importance of the duty she carried. The applause began slowly, then built to overwhelming volume. Merrick watched as Hartwell approached the portrait, studying Sophia's work with the same intensity she brought to examining naval charts. For a moment, her composed expression cracked slightly, just a momentary softening around her eyes. When she turned to address the assembled crowd, her voice was steady, but carried an emotional resonance that many had never heard from her before. "This portrait will hang in the Academy's Great Hall," she said, "where generations of future officers will pass by it. Young women will see it and understand that capability transcends gender. Young men will see it and understand that merit matters more than tradition. That, more than any honor or title, is the legacy I hope to leave." She paused, her gaze finding Merrick's across the crowded hall. "When I first began this position, I believed that transformation could be achieved through superior strategy and uncompromising dedication to excellence. I believed that if I simply proved myself capable enough, intelligent enough, and strategic enough, others would follow. That was only partially true." She gestured toward Merrick. "What I learned, what this man taught me through his willingness to embrace change and challenge his own assumptions, was that transformation requires allies. It requires people who are courageous enough to question their biases, humble enough to recognize when they've been wrong, and committed enough to work toward a future different from the past they've inherited." The final words hung in the hall. "Thank you, Admiral Merrick, for being that ally. And thank you to all of you who have carried forward the work of building a Navy based on merit, on excellence, and on the principle that leadership belongs to those most capable of providing it, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Later that evening, as the formal ceremonies concluded and most of the attendees had departed, Merrick found Hartwell standing alone in the grand hall, gazing at her portrait in the candlelight. "It's remarkable," he said quietly, approaching her. "Sophia captured you perfectly." "She captured a moment in time," Hartwell replied. "A moment when I believed I was changing the Navy. What I understand now is that the Navy was ready to be changed. I simply provided the catalyst." Merrick extended an envelope. "Your next assignment," he said with the slightest smile. Hartwell opened it to find a key and a letter appointing her as the permanent director of the Naval Strategic Institute, a new position created specifically for her, allowing her to continue shaping naval theory and training future strategists without the administrative burden of active command. "You anticipated this," she said, reading the appointment. "I know you," Merrick replied simply. "You could never truly retire. You're not capable of stepping away from the work." Hartwell smiled, that rare, genuine expression that had become slightly more frequent in recent years. "No," she agreed. "I suppose I'm not." As they stood together in the candle-lit hall, watching their combined reflections in the portrait's glass, Merrick reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun in a dingy tavern with a woman studying maritime maps. He had witnessed something that defied the conventional understanding of what was possible, the complete transformation of a centuries-old institution through the determination of a single individual willing to challenge every assumption, defy every expectation, and prove that excellence has no gender. The portrait would hang there for centuries, a silent testament to the day when a woman walked into the Navy and refused to accept the limitations others had decided for her. And in doing so, she had changed not just the institution, but the very definition of what was possible. The end.